January 3, 1944. The jungles of New Guinea steamed under a suffocating dawn. The humidity hung so thick you could not distinguish between air and water. Everything was wet. The ground beneath the feet of the soldiers was not earth, but a living thing, decomposing vegetation, insects, fungal growth, the perpetual decay of a tropical wilderness that had been turning death into life for 10,000 years. Sergeant Masatoshi Nakamura stood in a prepared defensive position near Sidor, New Guinea. He was 31 years old, a career soldier. He had fought in Manchuria during the occupation. He had survived the campaigns in China. He had earned promotions through competence and discipline. He understood war as a Japanese soldier understood it, as a test of spirit, of will, of the superiority of the warrior class over the material concerns of lesser peoples. He was about to have that understanding shattered. Around him, approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers occupied a network of bunkers and prepared positions. They had been digging in for months. The Americans were coming. This was certain. The American invasions had been moving through the Pacific in an inexorable march. Island after island, atoll after atoll. Each one met with resistance. Each one eventually conquered. But the Americans were slow. They were methodical. They were obsessed with overwhelming firepower rather than bold maneuver. They would attack with numbers, with artillery, with aircraft. They would do everything the hard way, the expensive way, the way that required industrial capacity rather than spiritual superiority. Nakamura had read captured American manuals. He had studied American tactics from previous engagements. He had concluded that Japanese soldiers, properly trained, properly motivated, properly positioned in terrain that favored the defender, could inflict catastrophic casualties on American forces. The jungle was an ally. The Americans did not understand jungle warfare. They were accustomed to open terrain, to mechanized movement, to the deployment of heavy equipment. Here, in the green suffocation of New Guinea, traditional advantages meant nothing. Here, spirit mattered. Here, courage mattered. Here, Japanese warriors would prove their superiority. Nakamura did not know that in approximately 36 hours, American soldiers carrying a weapon classified as experimental and unreliable would appear at the edge of his defensive perimeter. He did not know that this weapon would transform his understanding of warfare. He did not know that his confidence would become terror. He did not know that the weapon he was about to encounter was itself a reflection of a deeper American advantage he had not yet comprehended. The M1 Flamethrower was born from a failure. In the early campaigns of the Pacific War, American infantry had struggled against Japanese defensive positions. The enemy soldier dug in. Protected by terrain and prepared fortifications, was extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. Artillery could level positions, but only if you knew where they were. Aircraft could strafe and bomb, but the coverage was incomplete and unpredictable. Infantry assault with rifles and grenades was slow, casualty-intensive, and often ineffective against an enemy trained to resist to the last man. American officers searched for a solution. They looked at German flamethrowers. They looked at Italian designs. They consulted engineers. They commissioned studies. What emerged was the M1 flamethrower. It was a crude device, a 50-pound apparatus strapped to a soldier's back. A mixture of liquid fuel, gasoline mixed with a thickening agent to make it more viscous, more likely to stick to targets. A tube extending forward. A trigger mechanism that ignited the fuel using an electric spark. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it was a nightmare.
The first models constantly malfunctioned. The electric ignition system would fail to spark. The fuel mixture would separate. The soldier carrying it was weighted down so heavily that movement became nearly impossible. In humid jungle conditions, the apparatus corroded. The seals leaked. The fuel degraded. Military officers who tested the M1 in 1942 and 1943 were not impressed. Most concluded it was an experiment that had failed, a dead end, a waste of resources that would be better spent developing proven weapons. The American attack began at dawn. Artillery first, 20 minutes of sustained bombardment that shattered the silence and turned the jungle into a chaos of explosions and smoke and cascading debris. Trees snapped, bunkers collapsed, the ground shook like it was alive. Then the artillery stopped. In the sudden quiet, the Japanese prepared themselves. They would counterattack. They would repel the Americans. This was the pattern. This was always the pattern. But today, there was something different. American infantrymen began to emerge from the smoke in the jungle, not in a single assault, in small groups, advancing slowly, methodically, many carrying unfamiliar equipment. The Army Ordnance community was divided. Some wanted to abandon the project entirely. Others advocated for continued development. The debate was not especially heated. There were more pressing concerns: new tank designs, new aircraft, new artillery systems. The flamethrower was a marginal concern. But a small group of engineers refused to accept that the weapon was unsalvageable. At the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, a team of ordnance engineers, led by Major William J. Foran, had become obsessed with the flamethrower problem. They were not trying to create something revolutionary. They simply wanted to create something that worked. They redesigned the ignition system. They experimented with different fuel mixtures. They tested new materials for the tanks that would hold the fuel. They addressed the weight problem by redesigning the frame to distribute load more evenly across the soldier's body. By late 1943, they had a working prototype. It was not perfect. It was heavier than they would have liked. The range was limited to perhaps 30 meters. The duration of burn was only 5 to 10 seconds at a time before the operator had to pause to let the ignition system reset. But it worked. More importantly, it worked reliably. The Army made a decision. Without great fanfare, without celebration, without anyone particularly believing this would change anything, they authorized limited production. Approximately 1,000 M1 flamethrowers were manufactured for deployment to Pacific units. Most commanders treated them as curiosities, interesting experiments, not primary weapons. They were sent to the Pacific Theater in early 1944. They arrived at New Guinea in January. They were distributed to frontline units with minimal training, minimal enthusiasm, and no particular expectation that they would be anything but marginally useful. The Japanese military intelligence services, monitoring American developments through limited sources, noted the appearance of this new weapon. Their analysis was dismissive. In a report sent to Tokyo in February 1944, Japanese military attaché in Berlin, Colonel Hiroshi Tanaka, wrote, "American forces have begun deploying a new incendiary weapon. Preliminary intelligence suggests the weapon is problematic. Limited range, limited duration, significant weight burden. Assessment: the weapon does not represent a significant tactical threat. Recommend continued emphasis on proven defensive doctrine." Japanese commanders in the Pacific received this assessment. They accepted it. They incorporated it into their doctrine. The flamethrower was classified as a minor threat. It was not taken seriously.
The American attack began at dawn, artillery first,
20 minutes of sustained bombardment that shattered the silence and turned the jungle into a chaos of explosions and smoke and cascading debris. Trees snapped, bunkers collapsed, the ground shook like it was alive. Then the artillery stopped. In the sudden quiet, the Japanese prepared themselves. They would counterattack. They would repel the Americans. This was the pattern. This was always the pattern. But today there was something different. American infantrymen began to emerge from the smoke and the jungle, not in a single assault, in small groups, advancing slowly, methodically, many carrying unfamiliar equipment. Nakamura, observing from his command bunker, saw them clearly through his field glasses. What were these devices? Why were the Americans carrying such equipment? The lead American rifleman began to advance through an area covered by Japanese machine guns. Nakamura had prepared for this moment. The machine guns opened fire. American soldiers fell, but the Americans kept advancing. They were not broken by casualties. They kept coming. Then one of the infantrymen knelt and raised the unfamiliar device on his back. Private First Class James Merriweather from Ohio had trained on the M1 flamethrower for exactly 3 weeks. He did not particularly understand how it worked. He understood that you pointed it at the enemy position, you pulled the trigger, and fuel sprayed out and ignited. He fired. The jet of flame shot forward 40 meters in a stream of liquid fire. It was not graceful. It was not precise. It was not beautiful. It was apocalyptic. The flame hit a Japanese bunker position directly. The ignited fuel spread across the fortification like a living thing. It found cracks in the structure. It found gaps in the protection. It found human beings in the darkness and converted them from soldiers to ash. The screaming began immediately. Japanese soldiers trained their entire lives to accept pain as the price of duty, to resist surrender, to die rather than retreat, were confronted with something their training had not prepared them for. Fire. Not metaphorical fire, not the fire of artillery or bombs, which was distant and abstract, but fire that reached into bunkers, fire that wrapped around body armor, fire that turned defensive positions into ovens. Nakamura, watching through his field glasses, felt something in his understanding of reality shift. What was that weapon? How was it possible? The American fell back, the flamethrower extinguished. The bunker was burning. Movement inside was visible. Men crawling out, burning men. Men whose uniforms and skin and humanity were being consumed by flames. Then another American appeared with another flamethrower. And another. 3 flamethrowers, coordinated with rifle fire, began systematically attacking the Japanese defensive line. What Nakamura witnessed in those 2 hours was not a military defeat in any traditional sense. It was the destruction of an entire psychological framework. Japanese defensive doctrine was based on certain assumptions. The enemy would approach with rifles and grenades. You would defend positions using machine guns and prepared fortifications. The side with the greater willingness to die would prevail. But the flamethrower operated outside these assumptions. It was not something you could defend against with courage. It was not something you could counterattack through will. It was not something that conventional training addressed. It was a tool designed specifically to break Japanese defensive positions by rendering them uninhabitable. Battalion Commander Major Yuichi Tsukada, observing the attack from a rear position, recorded in his diary, "We encountered a weapon today that I do not understand. It projects fire from a distance of 30 meters or more. It saturates positions with burning fuel. Soldiers trained to resist, trained to hold positions, are being driven out by fire rather than by direct assault. The enemy did not use numbers to overwhelm us. They used a device that our training did not account for. 14 soldiers burned to death in Bunker 3. 17 more had to be evacuated because the position became untenable due to fire."
Before the Americans arrived with flamethrowers, Japanese commanders had been told these devices existed. They had been told they were experimental.
They had been told they were unreliable. They had been told they were not a serious threat. This assessment had come from Japanese military intelligence, which based their analysis on limited sources and, crucially, on their preconceived notion of what American technology was capable of. Japan had been at war for 13 years, since 1931. They had fought against equipment and tactics from which they had learned lessons. American tanks were slower than German tanks. American infantry tactics were more rigid than German infantry tactics. American engineering was competent, but not innovative. This was the mental framework. This was the lens through which Japanese officers interpreted new information. When reports of American flamethrowers arrived, they were filtered through this framework. The reports were almost dismissed out of hand. In a communication from the Japanese 18th Army headquarters in Rabaul to field units in New Guinea, the assessment was brutal in its dismissiveness. American forces have introduced a new incendiary weapon. Initial reports suggest the weapon is of limited tactical value. Range is short. The fuel supply is limited. Weight makes deployment in jungle terrain impractical. Recommend treating this weapon as a distraction from American artillery and air superiority, which remain the primary threat. Soldier morale should not be affected by introduction of this device. Japanese officers read these communications and accepted them. Why would they not? The assessment came from higher headquarters. It was based on analysis. It made sense. The flaw was that it was based on information that was, crucially, incomplete. The flamethrower was not a weapon that Japanese intelligence had adequately studied. It was not a weapon that American field commanders had been particularly enthusiastic about. It was not a weapon that seemed, on paper, to be revolutionary. But on January 3, 1944, at Sador in New Guinea, it proved revolutionary. Not because it was theoretically superior, but because it existed, it worked, and the Japanese had dismissed it without understanding it. As word of the flamethrower attack spread through Japanese units across New Guinea, the response was complex. Some commanders maintained their dismissal. This was an isolated incident. The weapon had limited value. Japanese soldiers had repelled the American attack, which, in a tactical sense, was true. The Americans had eventually consolidated at a new position and broken off the assault. But the cost had been extraordinary. 47 Japanese soldiers had been killed or severely burned. Another 31 had been evacuated. For very little strategic gain on the American side. The Americans had advanced perhaps 300 meters and then halted to establish a new defensive line. But the psychological cost was something different. A younger officer, Lieutenant Kenji Harada, wrote in his personal diary, "Today I had to witness soldiers burning to death, not from bombs or artillery, but from an American device that shoots fire. The weapon is portable. It can be carried by infantry. This changes everything. We have always believed our soldiers' superior training and willingness to die gave us an advantage over American technology. But this weapon is different. You cannot overcome fire with courage. You cannot repel fire with spirit. The Americans have introduced something that makes our traditional advantages meaningless."
The M1 flamethrower that arrived in the Pacific in early 1944 was the product of exactly the kind of engineering persistence that the Japanese had underestimated. It consisted of two main components. The fuel mixture, a combination of gasoline, thickening agents, and additives. The thickening agent, typically a soap-like substance, made the fuel more viscous so that it would stick to targets rather than flowing off. This was not complicated chemistry, but it required experimentation to get right. The delivery system, a pressurized tank filled with nitrogen gas that forced the fuel through a nozzle. When the operator pulled the trigger, an electrical spark ignited the fuel, creating a stream of burning liquid. The ignition system, refined through months of testing, was the crucial innovation. Previous versions had frequent misfires. The new design was reliable. The delivery system could be carried by one soldier and operated with minimal training. The result was a weapon that required no advanced technology, no exotic materials, no revolutionary engineering. It required only persistence. It required only the willingness to keep trying after initial failures. It required only the engineering culture that American institutions possessed. As the war continued, and flamethrowers appeared in more and more American operations, Japanese military observers began to understand something that challenged their fundamental assumptions. American military innovation was not driven by theoretical brilliance or radical new approaches. It was driven by practical problem-solving, by willingness to fail, by industrial capacity that permitted extensive experimentation, by a system that rewarded fixing problems rather than accepting them as permanent. This was different from German military innovation, which tended to emphasize revolutionary designs. Different from British military innovation, which tended toward conservative improvement of existing systems. American innovation was characterized by pragmatic persistence. Find a problem, try to fix it. Fail. Try again. Fix the problem, manufacture the solution at scale, deploy it to the field. The flamethrower embodied this approach perfectly. A Japanese officer named Colonel Takeshi Yoshida, who would survive the war and later serve as a military historian, reflected on this in a post-war memoir. The American flamethrower was not the most sophisticated weapon we encountered. It was not the most fearsome, but it represented something about American military culture that we did not fully understand until too late. The Americans did not assume war would be won by the side with the most spirit or the greatest willingness to die. They assumed it would be won by the side that best solved the practical problems of warfare. They experimented, they failed, they succeeded, they manufactured, they deployed. It was methodical. It was patient. It was, in the end, irresistible. 6 weeks after Sidor, American forces encountered Japanese defensive positions at Eniwetok Atoll. The Japanese had prepared carefully: fortifications, machine gun positions, anti-tank obstacles, fields of fire cleared through the jungle. Everything was ready. The American assault began with artillery and air bombardment. Then, once the artillery lifted, infantrymen advanced. Among the first wave were flamethrower operators. By February 1944, more flamethrowers had arrived in the Pacific. American commanders had begun to understand their value. Flamethrower teams were being trained specifically for jungle assault. Tactics were being developed to coordinate flamethrower fire with rifle fire and grenade assaults. The flamethrower was transitioning from experimental weapon to standard tactical element. Private First Class George Westbrook, operating an M1 flamethrower at Eniwetok, recorded in a letter to his family, "I fired the weapon today at enemy positions. The effect was immediate and total. The Japanese soldiers manning the position were forced to abandon it. Some were burned, most simply fled the fire, which I guess they considered a worse fate than being shot. The weapon is devastating not just because of its destructive power, but because it operates outside the normal calculus of warfare. It makes prepared positions untenable. It negates the advantage of defensive preparation. It is, I believe, one of the most effective weapons we have." As flamethrowers appeared in more operations, their psychological impact on Japanese soldiers became increasingly evident. Japanese defensive doctrine had been based on the assumption that if you prepared your position well enough, if you defended it with enough courage, you could hold it against any assault. The flamethrower shattered this assumption. It was not about courage. It was not about preparation. It was not about willingness to die. It was simply about whether you could survive fire. And you could not. Japanese soldiers who had been trained to resist to the last man, who had been conditioned to accept death rather than surrender, found themselves facing a situation where resistance was meaningless. You could not fight fire with a rifle. You could not resist fire through spirit. You could not negotiate with fire. You could only flee. And fleeing was a surrender of the fundamental principle of Japanese military culture. This created a psychological crisis that went beyond the simple tactical effects of the weapon.
Captain Jiro Hasegawa, commanding a Japanese company at Peleliu in September 1944, wrote in his final letter, "The Americans have brought fire from the sky and fire from the ground. They have weapons that turn our prepared positions into ovens. They have weapons that transform jungle into inferno. We have trained to resist Americans with rifles. We have trained to resist Americans with artillery. But we have not trained to resist Americans with fire. And now the fire has broken something in our soldiers' willingness to fight, not because they are cowards, but because fire is something that transcends the normal rules of warfare. Fire does not care about courage. Fire does not recognize military virtue. Fire simply burns." By mid-1944, as flamethrower operations became standard in American Pacific campaigns, the weapon's strategic implications were becoming clear. The flamethrower was not a superweapon in any revolutionary sense. It did not solve the problem of capturing a determined enemy. It did not make American casualty rates trivial. But it changed the calculus of island warfare. Japanese defensive strategy had been based on making each island so expensive in American lives that eventually American political will would collapse. The price would become too high. The American people would demand peace. But the flamethrower, combined with American artillery and air power, made this strategy increasingly untenable. Japanese soldiers could still inflict casualties on Americans, but they could not prevent the Americans from taking the island. The cost was too high. The American technological advantage was too great. What had once seemed like a plausible strategy, defense to the last man, inflict maximum American casualties, break American will, became increasingly obvious as a path to suicide. Private Yoshiro Tanaka was 24 years old. He was from Kobe. Before the war, he had worked in his father's textile business. He had been drafted in 1942. He had served in defensive positions on several islands. He had never seen a flamethrower. On March 15, 1944, defending a position on Tinian, he finally encountered one. An American soldier approached his position wielding the flamethrower. The Japanese position was a small bunker with a machine gun. Tanaka was one of 3 soldiers defending it. The American pulled the trigger. The fire came so fast that there was no time to respond. The jet of burning fuel shot through the aperture of the bunker and ignited inside the position. The temperature rose immediately. The air became toxic. Tanaka panicked, climbed out of the bunker, and ran. As he ran, he did not experience this as a defeat. He experienced it as survival. The alternative, staying in the burning bunker, was death. He survived the war, and decades later was interviewed by a historian. He described the moment. "The fire came without warning. The heat was so intense I could barely breathe. My uniforms were already beginning to char. The only thought in my mind was to get away from the fire. I ran. I was ashamed to run. I was ashamed to abandon my position. But the fire gave me no choice. You can resist bullets with courage. You can resist grenades with proper positioning. But you cannot resist fire. You can only flee from it." The moral dimension, fighting with fire. As flamethrowers became commonplace in the Pacific War, American soldiers began to struggle with the moral implications of the weapon.
The flamethrower was extraordinarily effective at forcing Japanese soldiers from prepared positions. But it also created a particular kind of horror: burned bodies. Soldiers who had been caught in the flames and had burned to death. Screaming. The smell of burning human flesh. American soldiers, most of them not particularly trained in moral philosophy, nonetheless began to recognize that they were using a weapon that inflicted suffering in ways that other weapons did not.